For the last 4 episodes, I've been hinting at something I call the nuclear town theory, and how it could go a long way towards explaining the unintuitive floor plan and aesthetic inconsistencies of the Spencer Mansion. It's not really something that deserves its own episode, and that's definitely not what this is, but I do think we should take a moment to establish what the theory is, and even go back to what we've covered in the previous episodes to see whether or not it holds water. After that, we'll take what we've covered and apply it to the rest of the available rooms on the first floor of the East Wing. Thing is, as this series has gone on and I've taken a harder look at the mansion than anyone probably should, I've started to notice some things that contradict this weird theory I've been cooking up. And the truth behind why the mansion is so strangely designed could end up being even weirder than I ever could have imagined. This is part 5 of Overthinking Resident Evil. Let's get right into it. Back in the day, the US military would build full-scale towns on bomb testing sites to get a look at the effects their weapons would have on their potential targets. They called them Doom Towns. When I was first playing this game and cooking up this series, one of the things that most perplexed me was how inconsistent the mansion interiors were. It swung wildly from expensive marble to your grandma's house to just plain unfinished. As time went on, I noticed similarities between certain rooms. Not only that, but there were common threads beyond basic aesthetics that tied them together. Sometimes proximity, sometimes purpose. And in search of an answer as to why some areas seem to be in much better condition than others, I came up with the nuclear town theory. The Spencer Mansion was built to be destroyed. But unlike Doom Towns, it wasn't built to test the bomb that took it out, but a different weapon entirely, the BOWs. I don't believe it was repurposed as a testing ground. I think it was always supposed to be a testing ground. Further, I think it was always meant to be destroyed. You can argue against that general idea fairly easily, especially coming at it from the remake, but no one puts a bomb big enough to take out the mansion above and the lab below without thinking they're gonna need it. So here's how this video is gonna go. We're going to go through all the rooms we've looked at before and view them through the lens of the theory I just outlined. Then we'll go through the rest of the first floor's East Wing. Finally, I want to go into a new theory that potentially contradicts the premise of this episode entirely. Let's start from the start. The first room in the game, the entrance hall, doesn't do a lot to sell my theory, but I'd argue that's exactly the point. The money's up front, where we can see it. It looks grand and expensive. If this were the only room a visitor were to see, they'd probably just assume the rest of the mansion is more or less the same. Huge and expensive looking. And if they were to step into the dining hall, that'd just reinforce this belief. It looks a whole lot like the entrance hall, and is very likely the room where most guests, expected or unexpected, invited or uninvited, would be ushered into. Again, the money's on the screen, so to speak. It's entirely likely that many people could have paid a visit to the Spencer Mansion and not gotten much further than this room. The tea room's the first change, and it's a big one. Large opulent rooms made of marble are traded for a cramped hallway with floorboards and wallpaper. It's not exactly cheap, and it's not completely out of place in the mansion, but it is a jarring change. I don't think the change is a complete deal breaker, but in terms of the big picture, it certainly helps with my theory. Something worth paying attention to is how rooms like this one change the further out we get from the center of the mansion. For example, the exhibition room is one door removed from the entrance hall, and like the dining hall, it's relatively similar in, well, not style, but expensiveness, I guess. It's visually quite unlike any other room we've seen in the series so far, but you can overlook that as the exhibition room is a room with a unique purpose, to display art, and the look of the room reflects that. But go one more room down into the L-shaped corridor, and like the tea room, the change is pretty noticeable. It's not exactly a cheap looking room, but it definitely looks a lot less expensive and fancy than the rooms that preceded it. Like the tea room, this is 2 rooms removed from the center. The northeast corridor is arguably the worst room we've seen so far. Awkward design, no natural light, kinda cheap and bare bones. Something worth noting is its stylistic similarity to the tea room. There's a couple of things to take away from this room, but the shape of it is the most relevant detail. The only bathroom in the house is unlike any room we've seen so far, though there are rooms we'll look at this episode and later on in the series that are aesthetically similar. The fact that this is the only bathroom in the mansion is not an insignificant detail in the theory. Neither is the fact that it doesn't seem to have been originally designed to be a bathroom. having no ventilation or windows. This Scooby-Doo trap in the middle of the mansion is very aesthetically similar to the entrance and dining halls, and while it might go against the theory, it will come into play later. The parlor is fairly unique, though not out of place next to, say, the tea room or the northeast corridor. It does look a bit for show though. It could be an outlier, but I think it reinforces the theory that the areas non-Umbrella personnel might see is where the money is. And that brings us right back to where we left off. If you start at the entrance hall and work your way out, you can see the quality of the mansion deteriorate room by room. Could be that the areas that are most likely to be seen by visitors are the only areas that are actually worth a shit, and the rest, like the homes in the Doom Towns, are just slapped together and given just enough love so as not to draw too much attention should an outsider stumble across them. I know it's a bit of a stretch, and one big detail we'll get into at the end of the episode sort of complicates that theory, but remember, this mansion's sitting on top of a lab and rigged to blow on a dime. It was never meant for anything more than a front and a testing ground. So it stands to reason that it wouldn't have been put together with the same level of care as a mansion that was designed to be inhabited. Again, only the areas that are going to be seen by people really had any level of polish. It's a glorified television set. So with all that in mind, let's keep going through the mansion and see if the rest of the East Wing's first floor can shed any light on the situation. We're starting at the end of the northeast corridor, in a room called the corridor to the back entrance. I don't want to spoil anything for anyone who hasn't played the game, but this room is the site of something much bigger and cooler than anything we're going to talk about in this video. If you know, you know. There are 2 zombies in this room, the most action we've seen since the dogs in the L-shaped corridor. The room is pretty spacious, and you've got a decent amount of room between you and them. If I had to take a guess, I'd say these 2 were on their way back from the guardhouse, or maybe just the garden area, trying to escape the mansion when they turned. They're wearing plain clothes, so it's possible they were groundskeepers or something. Maybe they were bitten outside and made it this far before bleeding out. It doesn't really matter, but it's fun to speculate. This room is yet another hallway of sorts. Another room between rooms. As mentioned before, it leads outside to the shed, garden, and eventually the guardhouse behind the mansion, but I'll save all that for another video. Other than that, there are 3 other doors to choose from. One is locked, one we're gonna save for another time. Before we talk about the third, let's take a look at the room. At first glance, it's very similar to the northeast corridor, which I personally think is great. Aesthetic consistency helps for immersion, and like the tea room, it's got the same, or at least similar, floorboards and skirting boards. It's got the same light fixtures, though this room is much darker than either of those 2. Even the wallpaper is similar. There are 2 paintings on the wall. One can't be seen, and the other is of a sort of villa, or just a building of some sort. I did try and figure out what it could be of, but I couldn't find anything. Also, no dialogue comes up when you inspect it, so yeah. That's pretty much all there is in this room to talk about, at least in terms of details. The camera work is pretty standard too, and that's okay. It doesn't have to be super artistic or anything. This room, at least now, is very much just something to be passed through on the way to more interesting places and events. All the shots give the player a fairly good view of the room, but none give everything away. The first camera angle is focused on the player, with the back half of the room hidden behind the perspective. There's little to no visual confirmation of any danger, so again, the player has to listen out for the zombies' groans and footsteps. On the plus side, the camera gives you more than enough space, so you can afford to let them come to you. Going a little deeper into the room affords you a better view of the space you've got to work with, something that will come in handy a bit later. The last few shots are here, and are more reminiscent of what we got in the northeast corridor. A bit tighter, and for the most part, looking down. The shot in the narrow hallway by the back door is pretty great. You can't see a thing, so your first move is to run into the unknown. Much like the northeast corridor, it does the best it can with what it's got, striking the not so simple balance of artistic and practical, of not showing too little or too much at once. I feel like in terms of the nuclear town theory, it could go 2 ways. That aesthetic consistency that I'm so irrationally fond of makes me think that it's not a rush job, but at the same time, it wouldn't exactly be a hard room to whip up. There isn't much thought put into the design, and aside from 2 pictures on the wall, there's nothing really going on. No real evidence that this house is, or even was designed for, habitation. Compare it to, say, the entrance or dining halls, or even something like the L-shaped corridor. At least that has some display cabinets. The further away we get from the entrance, the less effort there seems to be in keeping up appearances. This is probably best seen in that narrow walkway by the back door, where the walls don't even look finished. I'm gonna call it a wash. There isn't enough here to make a call either way. It could well be a normal room that's fallen into a state of minor disrepair, but it could also just be something they slapped some wallpaper and skirting boards on to hide the mansion's single-use identity. As I said earlier, I'm not going to bother with the outside area yet, so that leaves the other two doors. I want to save the second one for a later video, so let's go through the first one. This door, the door on the right from where we entered, leads to a tight room called the East Staircase. I don't know why, but this is one of my favorite rooms in the game. There's nothing I can point to explain why. I just think it's rad. Visually, there isn't a whole lot to say about it. Of the rooms we've seen so far, it most resembles the bathroom. The walls are almost completely textureless and look to be drywall or plaster or whatever, with a real bare bones coat of paint over it. The floor looks nice enough, but not exactly opulent. Ditto the skirting boards and light fixtures. My point is not to criticize, but just to make a note of these things in relation to the nuclear town theory. As it stands, I'd argue that this room is a great example of what I've been getting at. It's at the arse end of the building and is so lazily slapped together. Drywall and a coat of paint with some pictures around the place just to throw someone off the scent. It's far from conclusive, but this room definitely strengthens the theory. There's a real nice looking landscape painting by the door you enter from. I can't quite make it out. Could be a garden or something, could be buildings or people. It's likely all three. The game itself does nothing to help you figure it out, but at the same time, it's not important. This whole series, I've been trying to find the origins of each painting and see if there's any meaning behind their selection, but I'm pretty sure I've just been wasting my time. One zombie hangs about this area. You've got space to deal with him, but it doesn't quite look like it. The hallway between the door and the rest of the room is quite long, so hanging back and letting it come to you is a strategy. But if you're impatient and don't take a second to listen, you can find yourself fending it off in close quarters pretty fast. Along with this zombie here, there are another two on the second floor. This area is adjacent to a bedroom and is clearly a busy thoroughfare, so it stands to reason that it'd be fairly populated with zombies. Not a whole lot else to say about it. Perhaps this one here was hiding out under the staircase when he turned. I can't think of anything this room could be referencing. Does give me The Exorcist vibes, but there's no way it's deliberately doing that. The camera angles are pretty good. There's a lot of depth in the hallway shots, either looking at the player in the distance or looking past them into the rest of the room. It manages to strike a nice balance between giving the player something to work with, but also keeping it all feeling tense and claustrophobic. The camera pulls back to a bird's eye shot when you enter the main part of the room. It does this wonderful job of emphasizing just how little you've got to work with, while also letting you play with all the available space at once. This kind of openness is not something we'll see often in this game, yet unlike the entrance hall, it doesn't give us any relief. I have a massive soft spot for this shot here, next to the storeroom door. There's nothing remarkable about it, it just feels cozy to me. I just found out there are a couple of extra shots in the director's cut version of this game that look pretty cool. They aren't necessary, but they add a lot of personality to the room. Before we head into the room under the stairs, I want to address the second theory I hinted at back at the start of the video. I don't know if you know this about me, but I place undue emphasis on aesthetic consistency in pretty much everything, which is why so much of this mansion bugs me. The aesthetic and consistency of this mansion gave rise to the nuclear town theory I went into earlier, and honestly, is probably largely responsible for this series as a whole. But working on the last few videos, and the next two after this one, I started to connect some dots that weren't necessarily there, but also weren't necessarily not there, if you follow me. See, the nuclear town theory is all well and good, as is the central argument that the further away you get from the entrance, the more the facade of the real mansion starts to fall apart. But as the series went on, a new idea came to me that kind of throws a wrench into that theory. See, there are two dominant aesthetics present in the mansion, and they are borderline incompatible. Here's my theory. There are two sources of inspiration for the Spencer Mansion. The first is its genius architect George Trevor, known for creating secret rooms and traps. The second is Oswell Spencer's original mansion in Europe, the Spencer Estate. As always, we won't be looking at anything released after this game, so nothing from the remake or RE5's Lost in Nightmares DLC factors into the investigation. So, with the aforementioned two dominant aesthetics and the two sources of inspiration, once we match aesthetic with inspiration, the rest of the pieces should fall into place fairly easily. Before I go on, I just want to say that future rooms and documents really help sell this theory, but I don't want to touch on anything we haven't already seen. As the series goes on, we'll keep adding pieces to it, same as the nuclear town theory and figuring out the last movements of Bravo Team. The first dominant aesthetic is the marble and red highlights, so the entrance hall, the dining hall, and the suspended ceiling room. The second is the more muted dark wood floorboards and wallpaper look. Think rooms like the northeast corridor, the tea room, the corridor to the back entrance, and I guess the parlor. Each room obviously has its own unique aesthetic, but the visuals are similar enough that the rooms in those two categories can be confidently lumped together without issue. So with those two aesthetics outlined, which belongs to Spencer's original mansion and which are George Trevor's additions. I don't think we have enough evidence to go on just yet, but let's have a look at what we do have. George Trevor had an affinity for traps and hidden rooms. While we haven't seen it yet, there is a secret hidden in the dining hall. The only real trap we've encountered was in the suspended ceiling room. We can say with more or less certainty, again, not counting anything that comes after this game, that the suspended ceiling room was not in Oswald Spencer's original mansion and is in fact purely George Trevor's creation. Between that and the dining hall secret, I'd say the marble rooms are his creations. That means the other aesthetic is likely taken from the original summer home in Europe. A cursory glance at similar buildings in real life help corroborate this, though not conclusively. There's way too much variation in designs for anything substantial, and really, none of this means anything anyway. There is, of course, the possibility that both are both, in a way, and George's contributions are more in the finer details, but that's something we'll have to figure out as the series goes on. Of the remaining rooms, I'd say the exhibition room is one of Trevor's, as is the U-shaped corridor, but the rest look to me like they were taken from, or at least heavily inspired by, the original summer home. There is a third aesthetic that I'm calling the Grim Fandango aesthetic, even though that makes no sense. It's the bathroom, the east staircase, and the east storeroom, though there are rooms we'll visit later that fit the bill too. Honestly, these rooms could be Spencer rooms, but who knows. My guess is that they weren't finished, or deliberately left fairly bare bones because they weren't likely to be seen by outside eyes. Now, some of you might have noticed a problem with this theory. George Trevor's story is present in the remake, but not in the original, invalidating it completely. And yeah, you're spot on. But George Trevor and his family were originally planned to appear in the original game, but were yanked out at the 11th hour. So while he's not mentioned in the original game, his presence and impact can still be seen. He is canon pre-remake too. The documents attributed to him in the remake are adapted from documents that are in the original game's files somewhere, and those same documents were released as part of the true story behind Biohazard, and later Resident Evil the book, the former being a Sega Saturn pre-order bonus for the director's cut, and the latter being available for order from Capcom's website, both released in 1997. Alright, onto the final room of the video. The east storeroom is the first completely safe area in the game. I mean, there are other rooms with no enemies, but the player has no way of knowing that. And the rooms that may not have enemies at first can have enemies later. The east storeroom is the first save room, and that's a sacred distinction. As soon as you hear that beautiful save music, you can unclench a little bit. It's called a storeroom, but honestly, I think it's just empty space. It's a bit too big to be a closet, and it's a bit too empty. This room definitely makes me think I'm onto something with my nuclear town theory. This room looks like an even more stripped back version of the east staircase. The floorboards are different, but the color of the wood is the same. The walls are the same, minus the skirting boards, and there's a single light built into the wall, pointed towards the ground. It goes a long way towards creating an atmosphere for this room. This is also the first time we get to use the item box. I don't really have much else to say on this, though while making this video, I did come up with another fairly outlandish theory. What if this room, and I suppose the item box, were put here deliberately for stars? I mean, it's a storage space, but all that's there is a single empty box. Like I said, I feel like this supports the main theory I've been talking about for this video, but as for this more out there second theory I'm cooking up, it doesn't end there. Depending on your difficulty level or whatever, when you first reach the item box, there's ammunition for you in there, and later on, Wesker leaves more bullets and healing items for you. I know that's a remake thing, but whatever. Yeah, it's not my best work. This has nothing to do with anything, but I love how the roof angles up under the stairs like that. Makes me think of those recording studios with the weird acoustic setups. There's only 2 shots in the room, and not much to say about either. They both give the player a good look into the room. It's a little detail, but this openness helps to put the player at ease a bit. It's the total opposite of the previous room in that way. The east staircase pulled back hard to show a bigger picture, while making the player feel somehow more claustrophobic and out of control. This room pulls back to make a small room feel bigger, and the player safer. I don't really have a whole lot else to say about this room. Its purpose is pretty obvious. It's a save room. A chance for the player to decompress, save their progress, and gear up for the next stretch. And while it's not the most exciting way to end the video, it does seem fitting to call it a night here. And so ends part 5 of Overthinking Resident Evil. Thanks for waiting, and I hope you enjoyed it. Originally, this episode was kind of a two-parter, with the next one being a sort of continuation of the themes and ideas explored in this one. But while rewriting the last 3 episodes of this season, it ended up changing a lot. I guess I'm telling you this in case you notice any similarities between the two. As of right now, the next 2 episodes are already recorded and are currently being edited, and season 2, episodes 8 to 14, have been mostly drafted. I'm aiming to make up for lost time and get both seasons out this month, but these videos take a long time to make, so I can't promise anything. Thank you all for being so patient. I hope between this video and the ones coming out later this month that the wait was worth it. Until next time.